there, and welcome to week 8 of Becoming a Good News Church. We're pretty much coming to the end now of this series as we ask ourselves collectively as a church and as individuals and as small groups as to how we can be good news in the town in which God has placed us. And I don't know about you, but I've felt incredibly challenged as we've gone through this series, as we've discussed it in our small groups, as we've listened to what God has to say to us on Sunday mornings. And we're going to continue that this week by beginning to focus on this question of how you can spot an evangelistic church. One of the things that most fascinates me about this chapter is the place where Graham Tomlin starts. When we say that phrase, how to spot an evangelistic church, I guess the first thing that we begin to think of is, the churches that are really doing something that is obviously evangelistic. So that church down the road, they're doing an Alpha course, so they must be evangelistic. That church are doing lots of things in the community, and they're doing lots of social action things. So therefore, they're doing that because they're wanting to be evangelistic. But Graham Tomlin doesn't start in that place, and I think I'm actually inclined to agree with where he begins. The place that he starts is this sense of adoration. This adoration of God. And if you remember, throughout this series, we've been looking at the point of personal holiness, this idea of distinctive Christian character that separates us from everybody else, people who aren't yet of faith. And it's interesting, when we start thinking about this sense of adoration, we start thinking about worship and why we worship, what we do when we worship. And the Bible calls us in Romans to be living sacrifices, and part of that is out of our sense of worship, out of our sense of adoration of God. And there is something about a person's relationship with God, that sense of adoration, that should be attractive, that should make people think and say, what have they got in their life? Because it seems to be wonderful for them, and I want it. I want to have those things. Throughout this series, we've seen people be challenged by testimonies where there's been something about a group of people that has been distinctive. There's something about their character that is distinctive. And when we look at adoration, when we look at worship, that is very much a part of that character, that sense of personal holiness. One of the things that I have been privileged to be involved in the last couple of years is something called the Natural Evangelism course. And part of that course encourages people to share and to write down some of their story of how they've come to faith, so that they can be better when they then express it to those who don't know Jesus. And what I've found fascinating when we've been doing that course, both here and at my previous church, was, there were significant people who played a part in that person's story of how they came to faith. But equally, there was a church event or a church service that they attended which had a level of significance that they have then attached to part of their journey. And I think there is a danger that actually we water down the significance that worship can have in a person's spiritual life, and in particular as an evangelistic opportunity in people's lives. Because many of the people on this course, they spoke about how they'd gone into a church service and they'd had a sense of awe. They had a feeling come over them, and what they're saying is through the worship service they were encountering the Holy Spirit as part of their worship service. And I think when we look at it further afield, when we look at things like Soul Survivor, when we look at things like Spring Harvest, you hear multiple testimonies from people who've been part of what is going on in those services. They've met with the Holy Spirit, and that has led them to make a commitment of faith. And for me, I find that fascinating. Sometimes I feel like we water down the significance that worship can play as an evangelistic opportunity. But it comes back to what we've been talking about, doesn't it, in recent weeks, this idea that if we are spending time worshipping God, we are becoming filled with his Holy Spirit, and therefore, ultimately, we are then able to show people who God is because we are being filled by the Holy Spirit. If we are not spending time in our own walk, in worship, in discipleship, in spending time with God, how are people ever going to see him? So I think one of the things that is important when we think about being an evangelistic church is actually an evangelistic church is a place where God is seen as the source of our adoration, the source of our praise, the source of our worship, because when he is, we naturally become evangelistic. One of the things that I think we see more and more on our televisions, and for me is a really encouraging thing, is when sportsmen, following a victory or something like that, will give God praise. So, I'm thinking perhaps of footballers or people like that who after scoring goal, they will look heavenwards and they will give God praise. Now, admittedly, we don't know necessarily where their faith is at, but there's something about what they are doing there that actually makes people notice what they are doing. My brother-in-law has written a book called Cross the Line, and it's all about Christian footballers. And one of the interesting things that I notice with them is that they see the way that they play football as a source of worship of God. They're using the gifts that God has given them as a source of worship. And in that there is something evangelistic. There is an opportunity for evangelism. There's a story from the days when Harry Redknapp was manager of Portsmouth, and he was telling the story of how many of the players would gather together before the game and they would pray together, and more people would become involved in the praying to the point where they converted their boot room to a prayer room. And for me, the act of prayer doesn't on the surface seem like an evangelistic opportunity. But people, because they can see there is something authentic about a person's relationship with God, that they're actually praying to God before they play football, that makes people step up and take a little bit of notice of what is going on. It's interesting, isn't it, that we perhaps don't think of things like prayer as an evangelistic opportunity. But I would make the argument that prayer is the thing that this world most needs. It's often the thing that we as people most often need. And actually it's the thing that people are quite receptive and open to receiving. I mean, how many times has it been that you have had that nagging sensation, usually the Holy Spirit, saying to you, maybe you need to ask that person if they'd like you to pray for them? And I think that as a church, we will be good news when we start to prioritise prayer as a resource that can actually be used in evangelism as well. When a church is able to pray for one another and is able to pray for people who are not yet Christians, or at least to offer prayer for people who are not yet Christians, actually that says something about the church that is really good news. And so my challenge is this: any time you get that sensation of, maybe I could offer to pray for that person, that they've shared something there and maybe I could offer to pray for them in it, we will bring blessing to this town when we do that, when we offer people prayer, and they will feel blessed because prayer is such a blessing. So your relationship with God is probably one of the first places that we start when we start thinking about an evangelistic church, that the sense of adoration, sense of worship is part of what makes a church evangelistic. But then Graham Tomlin goes on to say some further things about this. He talks about the sense of belonging, he talks about the sense of compassion, and he also talks a little bit about discipleship as well. One of the things that I find fascinating is when he talks about belonging, he talks about this idea of church at times being a place where people are passive recipients. And he says some things as well about sermon craft and things like that I think both Mark and myself have found quite interesting, and that we would wish to engage with some of the things that he has said there. But I think I can agree with this. This sense of belonging is actually a sense of being a part of what is going on as well. It's not about turning up to church and being a consumer. And I think that is the danger sometimes with church life, that we can turn up expecting to be fed. And yes, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. That does happen, and it should happen. We should go to church to be fed, but equally, we should be going to church to play our part. That sense of belonging shouldn't be passive. Belonging should be a part of actually being engaged with what is going on, to use the gifts that God has given us for his glory as part of our own personal worship. So once again, we come back to this sense of worship, and belonging and serving and being a part of the church actually is part of worship as well. He also goes in to talk about compassion. At the beginning I talked a little bit about a church that is sometimes seen to be evangelistic is the one that shows social care, that's involved in social action. Once again, I think that feeds out of this sense of adoration, this sense of worship. If we love God, then we will love our world, and we will want to serve our world. We want to be a part of making sure that God's creation is taken care of, and therefore social action and looking after people through compassion is very much a part of that. And then he talks about this idea of discipleship as well, that an evangelistic church is where people, go on growing. And we've addressed that in previous weeks, haven't we? We've talked about this sense that, we don't stay as babies as Christians. We want to be fed, we want to be going on in our own personal walk, in our own journey. But once again, that feeds back into that sense of our relationship with God. We want to grow, we want to go on being changed, we want to go on being transformed as part of our worship of God. So it's fascinating seeing how all of those things feed together. The final thing that Graham Tomlin talks about in this chapter is evangelism itself. You will spot an evangelistic church when they are doing evangelism. And for him, this in many ways is seen by the relationship that the church has with words. And in that sense, he talks about the Inquirer course, so things like Alpha, things like Christianity Explored and things like that. And so he sees evangelism as the way in which we then show and communicate to people through words what the Christian message is. We can have all those things in place, we can have action happening, we can have Christian action taking place, but if we're not backing it up with words, it doesn't really mean anything. So even in the Bible, Jesus tended to do something, he would then back it up with words. And I think the danger is in becoming a good news church, you do a lot of good things for people in the community, you do a lot of action, but actually you don't then back that up with words. And so perhaps one of the things that we need to think about as a church is how we facilitate evangelism for people who are perhaps inquiring about what Christianity is. So they may have come to be a part of the worship of the church, they may have had that sense of belonging, but actually there's not quite belief there yet. And that happens through these inquiry-based courses. What I would say is that I think that evangelism is almost like the last step in this. I think that the 4 other things before need to be in place, and specifically I think that our relationship as a church with God has to be the thing that takes priority, because when our relationship with God is seen as the most important thing, then evangelism will naturally happen as a result of that, because you can't love God without also then, by extension, then love your neighbour as well, and that happens through evangelism. So I'm going to hand over to you now. And this section of the Provocative Church book that you have, you'll notice, has quite an extensive audit section to see how we measure against the marks of an evangelistic church that Graham Tomlin has laid out for us. What I would like you to do as a small group is to make sure that you do those together in some way. Perhaps do them individually, but also do them together. And then Mark and myself would really love to hear what you think, where we stand and all those things, where our sense of adoration is as a church, where our sense of belonging is, and all those things. Feel free to answer those other questions that are in the back of the book, but we would love to hear a little bit more about what you guys think about the direction that we are in as a church.